Welcome to our first fantasy football podcast here on the campus of Central Penn College. Nightly news members Ian Kemmerer and Brian Christiana join me, Professor Miller, to talk fantasy football. This is actually our first podcast that we're doing that's sort of outside of the purview of what's going on here at Central Penn College. So we hope that this is very valuable to you, and bear with us. This is our first time doing something like this. So all of us are fans of football and fantasy football specifically. I know I have been playing, oh my gosh, for almost 20 years. It's so crazy to figure how I've been playing for that long. And I know that you gentlemen have played for a considerable amount of time. Brian, how long have you been playing?
This is currently my fourth season doing fantasy football. I've been doing it very well, and I mean, I've had much success with it. Of course, you're not going to have the greatest teams in the world, and I mean, it's a fun game for everybody.
Ian, how about you?
Yeah, this is my going on to my fifth season. Like Brian said, you're not going to have the great dominant team, but it's a good way to get into looking at players and see how they rank in your perspective.
Well, something as I do want to point out from the beginning, I want to just let everybody know that we are by no means experts. We don't get to spend all of our time doing this, so we just want to let everybody know that this podcast is really for the beginner that's playing fantasy maybe for the first or second year, maybe hasn't played before, maybe isn't even really familiar with every single player, because that's one of the toughest parts of joining fantasy football. I mean, there's legitimately 10 to 15 players on every single, if not more, that you could realistically take a look at. Yeah. So it's difficult unless you're studying the game in and out, watching every single game outside of highlights, to be able to understand all of the different players. And so I do want to point out, this is the way that we're going to do this podcast is really just for the beginners, the newbies, if you will, to fantasy football. Now, fantasy football is often the first fantasy game that people play because it's relatively easy to get into. There's so many resources out there. There's fantasy football magazines, apps, ESPN, CBS Sports. They're two of the big ones. Yahoo also right there. They give you a lot of resources for free. So, when you're first getting into fantasy, there are a few things that you can take advantage of. One is, and maybe I'm just old school by saying this, is that I always grab one of these fantasy football magazines.
Definitely. Great
so I have the Fantasy Football Index. There are several out there, and from every one you read, if you go and read another one, it's going to say something different about. So then that's really what we're just trying to do, is trying to project someone's value, because really fantasy football is nothing more than a crapshoot, in my opinion, because a lot of what it is comes down to, are your players healthy?
Definitely.
And a whole nother issue is when you're midweek and you're looking to maybe pick up a player, a lot of times these guys are questionable.
Yeah.
And last year, one of the big things happened, and I wanted to first start off with you guys because we're going to talk about a lot of things today. We're going to start off by talking draft strategy. We're also going to take a look. We all did our top 25 players. We also want to discuss some players that changed teams, both from the running back and the wide receiver perspective. And we'll wrap up with talking about some of the top 5 impact rookies of the upcoming 2017 season. So I want to start off the conversation on draft strategy, gentlemen, with a major rule change that happened before the beginning of last season. And the one I'm alluding to is the fact that there is no longer a probable designation for injury. So basically, it's you're questionable or you're out. I mean, there's like no in between. And originally, it was created because a lot of the time people would just constantly be probable. Because basically, if you were given a probable designation, that meant that you received some type of treatment. So then you'd have people like Tom Brady is often sort of the poster child of this, that would constantly, every single week, end up probable. So they basically did away with the probable designation, and now everyone is questionable. For fantasy players, this has had a significant impact. So I want to go to you guys and talk to you. How do you feel that this changed your strategy last year with the lack of the probable designation on injuries?
It changed because of the players that I really wanted. normally they're questionable or probable. Now they're like considered out. Like it changed my league because I like to pick out first, like do a mock draft, get the ones, and then when it comes to the draft time, then I can look and see if my guy is available. But when I found out some of my players were unhealthy, that was a big problem because now I had to go back, change everything. It was just hard because of people get hurt in training camp and preseason. They really shouldn't be taking too many hits because it can really hurt their career.
Well, certainly the fact that a lot of times in training camp, you'll always have a major injury that happens, and that affects draft strategy too. So one thing I think that, to Ian's point, you want to make sure that you do is, before your draft, really take a look at who has been injured and how serious they are. And a lot of times in training camp, they really don't come out with a whole lot of information that's helpful to us. So you always got to be careful if you're rolling the dice on someone who's hurt in the preseason. Brian, what do you think on a week-to-week basis? How did the questionable designation change the way that you went after players on the free agent wire?
Well, it definitely made me look more at the free agents. I mean, let's take in perspective. Ezekiel Elliott for several weeks was considered questionable and then probable. I was always looking to see who the best free agent available was. A very popular one. In 2015, he was one of the highest picks, but C.J. Anderson, he had a decline of a season, don't get me wrong, but he was always one I always considered taking, and I really feel like now that probable is out of the question, it's going to impact fantasy very often too as well.
Well, and a lot of what it is, guys, is really just making sure that you've got backups. And it also has led to the importance of Sunday morning. It didn't used to necessarily be such an important for a fantasy player to be up and be ready Sunday morning, but honestly, I can't tell you how many times that someone was questionable, and all week it was just like, no one knows if they're going to play.
In the last minute, they would change it, and you're just like, oh man, I have to change that. And you really were freaking out pretty much of what you're going to do and what is the best option available.
Well, and another thing, you mentioned C.J. Anderson earlier. You got to remember also Jamal Charles now in Denver as well. So it remains to be seen how that works out in Denver. Well, let's talk about some other of your draft strategies, gentlemen. I'm just going to turn it over to you. What are some, and again, I don't want you to give away all your secrets here, but what are some of the typical strategies? Now, obviously, if somebody very, very high, let's say you have the 5th pick and no one picks Le'Veon Bell, well, more than likely your draft strategy is going to be out the window because you're probably going to take someone like Bell. But assuming that the draft board follows the way that you think it's going to, what are some things that going through the draft that you should always tell a newer player that maybe they should start considering?
Well, you always have to consider, like, let's say a receiver like Odell Beckham Jr. Okay, they just got rid of Victor Cruz. He signed with, I believe, the Chicago Bears, and they have Sterling Shepard, great player, and they recently drafted a new tight end out of the University of Miami, who I think will be a very good receiver player and a good blocker. So I would say his receptions will go up, but he will be going against the best cornerbacks in the game. Let's say a Josh Norman, or
and they've got a history too, of course.
Yeah, and we're still waiting to hear about the news of Darrelle Revis. So wherever he goes,
And yes, Cruz did go to Chicago, which could be very interesting, too, because obviously Chicago lost star receiver Alshon Jeffrey. What are some other things that you want to keep in mind, maybe about how you draft and who you're drafting? Where? Are there specific areas that you try to key in on a certain position?
Definitely. This might surprise you, but my strategy, don't right away go for your quarterbacks. I mean, they're going to be around, and I took Russell Wilson last season, and I made the mistake of taking him very high, and it cost me big time. I took Antonio Brown with the first overall selection, and then I took Russell Wilson, and it really came back to bite me because you only need a backup quarterback, don't forget, for 1 week, really, because of the bye week. So, definitely take your running backs, your receivers, and, tight ends, they're very important because there's a limited number of huge tight ends that will have a big impact on your fantasy game, like Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, Jordan Reed. Dwayne Allen and Jared Cook. So just keep out looking.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up here, and I don't mean to steal your thunder, and I'm going to come right back to you, is you mentioned quarterback. One of the things that you have to understand when it comes to selecting a quarterback is there are so many. I want to say a lot of the quarterbacks are very, very similar. Let me give you an example here. Aaron Rodgers, who almost always is going to be top 3 quarterback off the board in almost anybody's draft. He had a really, really good season last year, 40 touchdowns, over 4,400 yards. But somebody, and this is just for comparison's sake, I'm going to go all the way down to the number 13 in touchdowns last year, Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins is the number 13 quarterback in touchdowns and had almost 5,000 yards. So you have to figure that, yes, touchdowns are very important. Obviously, fantasy football is a very touchdown-driven league. Though you do want to note, does your league give 4 points for a passing touchdown or 6? Because if you're getting 6, your quarterbacks might actually move up a little bit. So typically what I'm doing here, literally all the way down to really 20. Cam Newton, number 20 last year in touchdowns, and he was the first quarterback off the board last year.
And that's with an injury-ridden season as well.
Well, yeah, he definitely did miss a couple games. But honestly, even all the way down into the 20s, you're talking about solid starting quarterbacks. Even someone like Drew Brees, who 37 touchdowns, another 5,000-yard season. Drew Brees is still 3rd in touchdowns. So, you could do worse than, you got Roethlisberger down at 6, Brady at 7. So, any of those guys are great starting quarterbacks.
Definitely.
So, by that rationale, now, again, it depends how the draft goes. But by that rationale, I honestly wait on my quarterback until maybe even the 6th or even 7th round to even start even looking at quarterbacks. Now, if there's a big run, say 3 or 4 of them come off the board in one round, then maybe you adjust your strategy. But going in, I'm typically not even looking for a quarterback until, the middle rounds of the draft. Ian, what are some other thoughts that you had on your draft strategy?
So last year I took running back Ezekiel Elliott. Took him first round. That was a good pick for me. But then going into the weeks, I really had to focus on my backups. So then I believe the 7th round I took another running back, C.J. Anderson. He got hurt. So I was trying to go through free agency. So I went and looked for a variety of running backs. Couldn't pick one.
So, and to your point about running backs, only 12 running backs even eclipsed 1,000 yards last year, which actually seems very low. Now, obviously, you got lucky with Ezekiel Elliott because he won the rushing title by over 300 yards, which is pretty incredible. But then when you're starting to go with your 2nd and your 3rd running backs, I find a lot of people who... Let me ask your opinion about this. What is your opinion on carrying 2 quarterbacks? You'd mentioned it earlier, Brian. You'd said, you really only need that backup for a bye week. So what is your opinion on carrying that backup quarterback?
It's hard because you have a backup quarterback for the bye week for your starting quarterback. Basically, he's only going to play one. He's going to be in your starting lineup one time. That's it. Then after the bye week is over, your starter goes back in. I drop my second string quarterback, and then I get a new either a running back or a wide receiver, something to fill my extra spot that I need. So that way, if any of my wide receivers or running backs get hurt, I can always fill in that spot.
I definitely agree with Ian on this one. A quarterback is your backup quarterback is really needed only for 1 week. So, might as well take him for 1 week and then just get rid of him. Go for a running back, a wide receiver, even if you need a tight end who's going to, maybe get you a couple points here and there.
I think the biggest reason why I would hang on to a starting or to a backup quarterback is in case of injury.
Yeah.
Because while even down to 20, you're looking pretty good with any of these guys because in the late teens you're looking at a Sam Bradford, a Dak Prescott, a guy like Alex Smith. Once you get beyond there, you're talking really thin. So let's say you've got an Andrew Luck, who you're probably going to have to take in the first few rounds if you want luck. He has had severe injury issues over the years, and he's not even sure he's going to be ready for the season. With someone like that, you almost have to carry a second one. And in addition, not to say that, guys like Rodgers or Cousins or Ryan or even Drew Brees are really injury risks, but these guys are all, other than Cousins, they're either at 30 or over 30, and there's a pretty good chance that maybe one of them misses a couple of weeks. Yeah. So is that extra roster spot really that important? Because if you lose a quarterback and your starting quarterback goes down, you're in a lot of trouble because there's not going to be anybody left on the free agent pool. And
speaking about, I think there's one quarterback you have to watch out. He was actually out for the whole season last year, and people are definitely going to be wondering, should I use him as a starter or a backup? And that's Teddy Bridgewater from the Minnesota Vikings. Tore his ACL, and he's recovering, and I'm hearing great things from training camp about him, and I'm really hoping he has a great season, fantasy and in regular football.
I'm actually interested in where he stands in that. Here's a recent article that says it's been nearly 11 months since that knee injury, and this is something that really, really looked terrible. I mean, it was, if you saw the injury and what all happened to him, I'm surprised that he's even able to walk. But do remember that Minnesota does still have Sam Bradford as well. Yeah. So I don't know that they're going to rush him back. Not to say that Sam Bradford's the answer, but he certainly played fairly well last year in limited opportures.
I mean, he better. I mean, they gave up a first-round draft pick for Sam Bradford.
Well, they needed him, and fortunately Philly was looking to move on with their new quarterback as well. Here's another couple of ideas, a couple of draft strategies that I have. It really depends year to year. It used to be that you always took a running back in the first round, and now it's more en vogue to take a receiver in the first round. When you have guys like Antonio Brown, T.Y. Hilton, Beckham, Jones, Mike Evans is even coming up, and one could argue Brandon Cooks had a huge year last year. Now that he's going to play with Tom Brady, I think he could be a very interesting look in the first round. The thing about it is I think a lot of people wonder, who do I go with in the first round? When it's your turn, how are you making these opinions on who to go with? And are you going in with the strategy of a running back or a wide receiver, Ian?
Yeah, well, it depends at the moment, because if I see a lot of running backs going off, I'm going to want to take a running back. If I see nobody has touched any wide receivers and there's still good name wide receivers up there, I'm going to take a wide receiver without a doubt.
For me, and this is something else I want to talk about, is the difference between a standard league and a PPR league. Obviously, PPR stands for points per reception, so this obviously impacts not only wide receivers, but certainly running backs who catch the ball out of the backfield. Now, Brian, say you're in a PPR league. Does that impact your decision of whether you're going to pick a running back or wide receiver?
Oh yeah, definitely. I believe that PPR, in my opinion, that's the way to go. I'm a good example of a player who I believe was good for PPR was definitely Mike Evans from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, famous Jameis, as they call him. I think he's developing and he's still on the rise, and the addition of Deshaun Jackson, I think, is really going to help Mike Evans develop. He is a tall man he's a cornerback's nightmare, because as you all remember, him and Johnny Manziel at Texas A&M, it was unreal.
It's interesting to me because a lot of people put Antonio Brown not only as the number one wide receiver, but as the number one player in fantasy. But yet Mike Evans, while 10 receptions back, had more yards and as many touchdowns and even 20 more targets than Antonio Brown did. So Mike Evans as a first rounder in a PPR league is not that crazy. Now, just some finishing touches here. For those of you who are still sort of new to fantasy football, one major mistake I see a lot of people making is when they're picking their defenses and their kickers. For me, I am typically going to grab a defense in the next to last round and a kicker in the last round. I see people taking kickers as high as like the 10th round. And if you look at the points that kickers put up, they're not that much different than one another. If you look at the number one kicker versus the number, let's say, 20 kicker, the difference is very, very small. In fact, if you look at, and this is just team field goals made, Baltimore with 38, all the way down to Green Bay with 26. You're talking about maybe a couple of points every week. Mm-hmm. So, and you can also look at a team like Pittsburgh and Baltimore. Baltimore last year was 24, Justin Tucker, 24 of 24 from 40-plus yards. He did not. Now, a guy like Tucker, maybe you reach outside of that last round, but outside of him, a lot of the rest of these guys are just, it's more opportunity than ability with kickers in fantasy. In fact, I know some people who are actually going away entirely from having kickers in fantasy leagues because it's so random how that happens. Defense, too. Defense is something that really changes from year to year, and it's really tough to... If we're just going to take a look at total defense. Houston had the number 1 total defense with Arizona as number 2. I mean, Arizona would have been a defense you'd think last year. Why would I pick these guys? They don't really have any superstars outside of their secondary. Of course, the Honey Badger, but even he was hurt quite a bit last year. So
Patrick, you know what I mean?
Patrick Peterson, yeah. Their secondary is very good, but their front seven, you wouldn't think they would have ended up the number 2.
Is that Chandler Jones? Is that?
Yeah, he's still around there, too.
Yeah.
But the thing is, gentlemen, is that I think that a lot of people overvalue, even when you look at a team like Seattle, who is almost, probably for the last 5 years, always the first defense off the board, they were still only number 5.
I want to bring up the fact about Houston. J.J. Watt, last season, he was out as well.
And they still did so well, and I think, but he's got, can he stay healthy? Having major back issues when you're a defensive end is
it's hard.
Yeah, it's an issue.
That's why they need Jadeveon Clowney to have a huge step-up season.
He's had injury problems as well. All right, so our main pieces of draft strategy for you guys, wait on defense and kicker until the end unless you're real high on a guy like Justin Tucker. PPR, we kind of thought, hey, maybe taking a look at some of these wide receivers this year. A guy like Mike Evans is very, very interesting in the early rounds, especially when you compare him to a guy like Antonio Brown. Yes, Brown had more receptions, but Evans had more yards, as many touchdowns, and 20 more targets. And in fact, Mike Evans, gentlemen, led the NFL in targets by almost 20. The next close, Beckham had 169 to Evans 175. So Beckham's still behind Mike Evans in targets. Now, might that change with Deshaun Jackson? Maybe. But you also got to remember, Deshaun Jackson has never been one to catch a lot of passes. He catches a lot of deep balls. So maybe everything will still stay right in line with where it was last year.
And the addition of Alabama rookie O.J. Howard.
Well, and Cameron Brate as well was solid last year. I had him in a couple of my leagues. All right, well, now we're going to move along to our second segment of the show for our 2017 draft strategy guide coming from Central Penn College with Professor Paul Miller, Ian Kemmerer, and Brian Christiana. All right, gentlemen, I'd ask you to come up with your top 25 player list of players on offense. So this is going to be quarterbacks, wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. So I want to just call out a couple of players, and I want to get your feedback on where you stand with these players. I'll tell you what, I'll kick it to you guys, and I'll let you all start it off. So pick somebody from your top 25. Let us know where you had them ranked, and then we will chat about them for a minute. Brian?
All right. I want to bring up David Johnson from the Arizona Cardinals, running back. He came in second behind Ezekiel Elliott last season. He definitely is on the rise in many people's eyes.
I had, and you had him number...
I had him number 3.
Number 3. I have David Johnson at number 2. Ian?
I don't have David Johnson at all.
Wow, not in your top 25?
No.
Oh,
wow.
Ian, I don't know, man.
No, I think I dropped the ball on that one. The guy I really focused on in my top 5 was DeMarco Murray. I think he's going to have a strong year with Tennessee, with their quarterback that they have. I think he's going to get a lot of good touches with the ball.
I've got DeMarco Murray at number 8.
I have him third.
DeMarco Murray. Let me tell you quick in a second. I have actually Man, I might not even have put DeMarco Murray on this. And you know what? I thought of the addition of Eric Decker going to Eric Decker going to Tennessee, and they just drafted a wide receiver out of, it might be Western Michigan, Corey Davis, I believe.
They've got a lot of weapons. They've got Derrick Henry.
Yeah.
They've got Decker. They want to start running Mariota more. I just think that's less opportunity for Murray. Murray also struggled last year with some injuries. Now, he didn't really miss any games, but he had some serious issues with, I believe, foot issues. But he still did manage 293 carries. Unfortunately, his last few weeks of the season were very poor.
Yeah.
Week 16, week 17, when you're in your fantasy football Super Bowl, DeMarco Murray might have gotten you there, but certainly didn't help on New Year's Day. 11 carries, 21 yards against Jacksonville. The previous week, 14 carries, 42 yards. Not what you want to see from a guy who's getting up there in age.
Yeah.
He is actually 29 years old. So
That's a lot of miles on a running back.
I'll tell you, to Ian's point, though, maybe this is a situation where they say, hey, let's ride this guy for all we can. Who knows how much time he's got left. So maybe Murray does get, 293 carries is pretty solid for running back. So I do like that pick there. Very, very controversial pick there, Ian, going there number 3 with DeMarco Murray. Brian didn't even have him in his top 25. I had him in at 8.
Oh, nice. Nice.
So we shall see. All right, I'm going to go to somebody that I really want to talk about, gentleman by the name of Brandon Cooks. I am extremely high on Cooks, and he probably will come up in our segment later about people who change teams. But I have Cooks at number 16, and I'm interested to see if you guys have him even in the top 25.
I don't. I don't. I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. This is
I really didn't get him in. The most effective guy that I got is I thought was Golden Tate. I have him at 6.
Wow.
You have him at number 6 overall.
Number 6 overall.
Wow. And do you think that's... Now, remember, too, Tate had some injury problems last year.
Yeah, but
and missed several games.
He also lost... He lost Calvin Johnson. Now, with him and Matthew Stafford.
I do like that because he's clearly the number 1 receiver in this offense. He did have... he didn't miss any games, but he really only had 3 big games the whole year. Now, that still being said, he still had 135 targets. I think where he struggled last year, first of all, getting in the end zone, only 4 touchdowns. And secondly, he really only had a fairly low average per catch at 11.8, which is pretty low in terms of wide receivers.
Ian, I'm sorry to interrupt,
No.
Mr. Mill, but Ian, you also have to realize Eric Ebron's there. This is a contract year for Eric Ebron.
Yeah.
And I think the emergence of Marvin Jones on the Detroit Lions offense, he is a very significant wide receiver who I believe Matthew Stafford is going to target more often.
So I want to talk about Cooks here for a second. Brady has, outside of Randy Moss, has never really had that number 1 wide receiver. Now, obviously, Gronk, there's no question about that. But last year, even, they struggled to find... I mean, he had, of course, Welker. Even now, he's got other guys. They've got 5 decent wide receivers. But this is the first time they're ever going to have somebody with the big play capabilities of Brandon Cooks. And, of course... There are plenty of people and plenty of mouths to feed, if you will. Edelman, of course.
Amendola.
I hear that there's a chance he doesn't even make the team.
Malcolm Butler.
Yeah.
So they do have some guys, but I just think that with Cooks, he's got some explosive abilities. Brady can still throw the deep ball. Brady, very accurate, only 2 interceptions last year. I think this is a breakout year for Cooks, and it's really kind of tough to break out because he had 78 catches for 11 73 and 8 touchdowns last year. I think the touchdowns is where Brandon Cooks really makes the next step. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he had certainly double digits and maybe upwards to 10 to 15 touchdowns in that offense that's going to score a lot of points. So for me, that was sort of my biggest sleeper, having Brandon Cooks at 16.
I like Brandon Cooks. The ability is definitely there with Rob Gronkowski as well. The question I have out of New England is they just lost Ninkovich the other day.
And this is, I mean, obviously we're going to try to keep it a fantasy focused here.
Definitely,
but no. You make a great point. In the game of football, it's becoming more and more problematic, the number of people who are retiring at a young age because of, you can only imagine, CTE. And maybe that's something we can talk about on a future podcast. But it is very sad that, and again, Ninkovich, I don't believe, came out and said that it was CTE related.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm sure that all of that goes into your thought process when you're determining whether you want to keep playing or not.
I wanted to ask you about when you said about the wide receivers Tom Brady has had. Where would you put Deion Branch in that conversation?
Branch, to me, was sort of like the 3 or the 4 there for several years. He did have some big catches in the playoffs. Certainly made some clutch catches, but he's just, just like a lot of these other players that he
like
has.
Like a Malcolm Butler.
And even Welker is probably a future Hall of Famer. Edelman, potentially. He might have the numbers to make it in. Certainly doesn't hurt with all the rings that they had. But I'm telling you, yes, they're good possession receivers, but I think Brandon Cooks really complements. And they did give up a first-round pick for Cooks, so I'm very interested to see how he fits into this offense. I'm very looking forward to hopefully drafting him on my team. All right, let's talk about a few more, gentlemen. We'll go back around. Let's maybe narrow this down a little bit. Where is maybe one of your big surprise entries on your top 25? Ian?
Carson Wentz, which is from Philly.
In your top 25. That's that's impressive.
Well, I have him under Dak Prescott, but he actually did a good job last season with the Philadelphia Eagles, and he is looking to impress. And with the new acquires that they got, Alshon Jeffries and Torrey Smith and LeGarrette Blount.
That's a very interesting Philadelphia Eagle offense.
Yeah.
They have basically reworked all their skill players from starting tailback to starting top 2 wide receivers. I think it's very interesting that you're considering Wentz that high, even with, honestly, to me, I think you can probably get Wentz a lot later in your draft, but I do appreciate the fact that you're taking into consideration all of the upgrade in talent. And hopefully this is his let's break out year, because last year, honestly, he had a really good year. But the big issue for him, 33 times sacked, and only 16 touchdowns versus 14 interceptions, one of the worst ratios in the league.
Well, you got to understand, he lost Lane Johnson. Lane Johnson was
they had a lot of trouble on their offensive line.
Yes,
last year.
they did. And Jason Peterson and Jason Kelsey, their line was so messed up. They had to get rid of people. Lane Johnson is able to come back this year. They just acquired a new left tackle, but I think that they're going to improve on their line probably in the next couple of years. But with Carson Wentz, how he can throw the ball, how he can get out the pocket, he's a two-way player. He can run the ball, but he can't run it so much as he can. But it comes down to, can he throw the ball in pressure?
I just want to say this as well. Carson Wentz, don't forget, was supposed to... He's not fully developed yet. They just threw him into that spot.
Well, you got to give him a lot of credit for actually how well he did do in that situation.
Yes, definitely.
Well, you gotta understand they traded
Sam Bradford,
Nick Foles to get Sam Bradford. Then they trade Sam Bradford to get the 14th pick for this year. Now, by throwing him in, you only had the backup quarterback last year, Chase Daniels. He wouldn't be able to be a good starting quarterback.
He's never gotten a chance. I actually like Chase Daniels.
Yeah, from Mizzou.
Yeah.
But other than that, now you bring back Nick Foles, who is hurt. So now he has to step up and say, okay, now I need to actually focus on more of trying to not be sacked a lot.
I do think that Wentz could take a step up. I think maybe top 25 is a little aggressive, but I do get your point. All new skill positions, second year in the league, looked great, mobile quarterback, tough guy, not going to probably miss games unless there's something very unfortunate that happens. Yeah. And honestly, he outside of his touchdown to interception, he's got some decent numbers. Mm-hmm. He's just got to avoid taking the sack.
Yeah.
I mean, he was in the top 10 here for number of sacks taken, and I think that's a very important element because you see guys like Matthew Stafford who take a lot of hits that they struggle with injury.
Cam.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, let's talk about somebody that's maybe a little bit aggressive on your perspective in the top 25.
All right. Well, I put mine. I'm actually in the air on two of them, and they're both from the state of Florida, playing for the Jacksonville Jaguars and Miami Dolphins. But I'm going to stick with the Miami Dolphins on this one with Jay Ajayi, running back.
I actually have Ajayi at number 22 on my top 25. But remember, Jay Ajayi, number 4 in the NFL in rushing last year with 1,272 yards, had a 4.9 yard average, and did have 8 touchdowns as well. So now a lot of people argue saying that Ajayi had those, 3 big games, and I think that maybe some of his numbers got a little skewed. He had 3 200-yard games last year. One against two of them against Buffalo, one of them against Pittsburgh. And outside of those games, he only had one other 100-yard rushing game. So sell me on Ajayi.
I mean, I think when Miami brought in Arian Foster last year, Jay Ajayi wasn't really thought of. I personally did not even know who Jay Ajayi is. Did you know who Jay Ajayi is? No. So, I mean, I think when I'm not 100% positive when Arian Foster decided to retire from the NFL.
It was early.
But I feel like Jay Ajayi exceeded expectations.
I mean, there's no question he exceeded it. I don't think anybody thought going into last year. I mean, he wasn't even the starter. To finish 4th in the NFL when he didn't even start for the beginning of the season. I mean, he had an incredible year and seemed fairly durable, even though he had some injury issues.
The Miami Dolphins, I believe, they're a very futuristic team. I liked their acquisition.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to move on to the next person that I want to take a look at here. Big one for me is Gronk. I have Gronk at number 14, just outside of the first round. We are going to be using the standard 10-team league when we're talking about rounds. Of course, some leagues have 12, some have 8, but your standard leagues typically are going to have 10. So we're looking at Gronk, maybe for the first time in a little while, outside of the top 10. Where do you guys have Gronk?
I have Rob Gronkowski at 7. He was actually my first tight end that I looked at in my top 25 as a big impact for a team. I like plenty of good, solid tight ends like Greg Olsen and Jimmy Graham.
Olsen, Kelsey led all tight ends in receiving last year with 1,125. Greg Olsen at 1,073. And then you go all the way down to Jimmy Graham with 923 yards. Although a big step in the right direction, he had a couple of down years there.
Yeah.
Now, why do you have Gronk at 7, Ian? With counting his injury history and counting the fact that not only do they have Cooks, still have Edelman, they also still have some really excellent threats out of the backfield. But what about my main concern with moving him down? Because I took him in the first round last year. I probably would have had him at 7 last year. His injury history.
Yeah. Well, it depends. Well, to me, he is always a good target for Tom Brady. He will be Tom Brady's bread and butter.
Blanket. Security blanket is another good term.
Just like if we're going back into a couple of seasons ago, Tony Romo, Jason Witten. That was a top 2 players right there.
No disrespect to Jason Witten, but I think Gronk's got a little bit more talent in the peak of his career, which you could argue that Gronk is certainly still in the peak of his career.
Yeah. Well, he can also he doesn't just run slants and bubble screens. He runs deep passes, and for him to be a big person and also run 40 to 50 yards and still able to catch the ball, that's a milestone right there for me, because if I'm going to have a tight end on my team that can get me a lot of yards, I'm going to pick that tight end.
So Gronk is 28 years old, only played and only suited up in 8 games last year, 2 of which he had 0 catches, another one where he only had 1 catch. So he basically only 5 games was he even usable last season. I think that's why I move him down here, and I would bet I don't get Gronk in any leagues. I bet he's going to go before I'm ready to take him, and he burned me last year, and I love him, and he can be a real difference maker at tight end, but to rely on Gronk and him staying healthy for a whole year, I just don't know. Brian, we're going to go to you for the last one. Let's talk about the last surprise player in your top 25.
Okay, I would like to include in this segment with a running back from the Chicago Bears, Jordan Howard.
Where do you have Jordan Howard?
I currently have Jordan Howard in the top 10 at number 9.
That's very interesting. I don't have him in my top 25. And it's not to say that I don't like him, and I certainly probably would grab him in the 2nd or 3rd round potentially. But, again, it does depend for me how the board is looking. Let's take a look at Jordan Howard's numbers. In the meantime, where did you have Jordan Howard, Ian?
I didn't have him at all.
So Jordan Howard actually number 2 overall in the NFL in rushing yards. However, only 6 touchdowns, which is an issue. Now, why are you so high, Brian, on Jordan Howard?
The Chicago Bears, let's be completely honest, they are not that good of a football team.
And Jay Cutler is no more.
The future is Mitchell Trubisky. And I believe, Kevin White was a first-round draft pick for them. And what happened to him, I believe he tore his ACL in his rookie season. So there is not, Victor Cruz is there, but what do you expect out of Victor Cruz, who has been injured so much? So the running game, I believe, is going to be a huge thing for the Chicago Bears. And Chicago fans, please support your Bears. They really need your support.
Brian, Jordan Howard only scored in 4 games last year. That's only 25% of the games. He did have that one big 3-touchdown game against San Francisco in December, but only scored 4 games. I'm not real sure that I'm as high on him as you. Obviously, he's not in my top 25, but I'd be hesitant. I mean, he's still a young guy. He's only 22, but with the way that Trubisky is, he's already having some issues in camp, we've heard. So that's a tough call there, but it's cool that you like him, and hey, he was number 2 overall in rushing last year. Ian, any reason why you left Jordan Howard out of your top 25?
No, not really. The reason I really left a lot of people out that you guys have named is because, let's take Jordan Howard, for example. He lost Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler lost, the Chicago Bears lost Alshon. Alshon was a big part of their wide receiver game. And now with him moving on to a different team, the Bears are just going down like how certain teams are still going down, like San Francisco. San Francisco is going way down, and they had that good year with
Colin Kaepernick
and
Frank Gore.
Yeah, all of them. They went to the Super Bowl and played in Baltimore.
I'll tell you, the one thing that I do want to point out about Howard is he is coming into his 2nd year, so 2nd year in the system. Maybe he takes that next step, but I just don't think they have a strong enough offensive line, and I don't think they have a strong enough offense with a rookie quarterback. Taking a running back with a rookie quarterback in front of him, it's not something that I want to roll the dice with. I'll typically roll the dice on a guy like, a Melvin Gordon or even an Ajayi, who I would imagine is going to have a strong offense. They're a good veteran quarterback in front of them. I'd roll the dice on a guy like that before I'd roll the dice on a guy like Jordan Howard, though I think that you can get some value. Maybe he slides to the 3rd round.
As I know you're a Washington Redskins fan, How do you feel about Jordan Reed with this team?
It's I'm glad that you mentioned that, and then we'll move on to the next segment here in just a second. I had on my list a 25 and a 25A, both from the Washington Redskins. Terrell Pryor, I really think, can have some serious impact. And Jordan Reed at number 26, I think that Jordan Reed is... certainly the way I ranked him, he's below Gronk, but I think I'm going to end up with Jordan Reed on more teams than I would have Gronk, because I think that I'm very high on Jordan Reed, whereas I'm probably a little lower on Gronk. I think Reed is amazing. He's got injury issues in his own right, and I just think the Redskins, I think Kirk Cousins is going to have something to prove, and I think that the Redskins are going to have a very, very strong offense. They got a new rookie running back in P. Ryan from Oklahoma. They've also got a couple of other guys that had some run last year. So I think they're going to have a pretty solid offense, and I think it all revolves around Reed.
I actually have Jordan Reed in here, and Rob Gronkowski did not make it.
Oh, wow.
I trust him much more than I do Rob Gronkowski.
Reed younger, but certainly as injury prone. So again, if you're paying for your strong tight end play, in my mind.
Definitely.
All right, we're going to just take a quick break, and we will be right back with the 2017 Draft Strategy Guide with Ian Kemmerer, Brian Christiana, and Professor Paul Miller in just a minute.